My wife cheated with her coworker. I let her think I didn't know. Welcome to Michael Tells Stories. Here, I share daily infidelity stories about unfaithful wives. Thank you for listening. I discovered it on an evening so ordinary that, had nothing followed, I might have forgotten it as easily as one forgets the taste of yesterday's dinner. The kitchen bathed in a dull yellow light, the wall clock ticking with an almost irritating steadiness, the faint smell of dish soap mixing with the remnants of soup still lingering in the air, and my wife standing with her back to me at the sink, drying the last plate, her shoulders slightly slouched from a long day at work, looking exactly like the woman I had lived with for 7 years. The woman I once believed I knew down to the rhythm of her breathing. Her phone lay on the table, face up, and the screen lit for just a second, long enough for a name to appear. A name I had heard before in passing, woven casually into work stories. The kind of name that usually meant nothing. Someone from my department, a guy on the project. Nothing worth remembering, except that night, for reasons I still struggle to fully explain, it stopped me mid-step, rooted me to the floor, because beneath that name was a short, painfully simple message. Did you get home yet? In another time. Another version of myself might have smiled and thought nothing of it. Coworkers checking in on one another. Harmless, normal, but it was precisely that normality, that quiet intimacy that didn't try too hard, that made my chest feel heavy, because I realized it had been a long time since I was the first person to ask her that question at the end of the day. She turned around, startled slightly when she saw me standing there, then smiled, that familiar smile I had fallen in love with, gentle, polite, just distant enough to keep me out, and asked why I was spacing out instead of going to change. And I nodded, lied easily, said I was just thinking if we had forgotten to buy something. And while she leaned over to turn off the stove, I reached for her phone, quickly, almost instinctively, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. There was no new password, no sudden wall between us. As if she truly believed I would never cross that line. Believed I was still the husband who respected her privacy without question. And I hated myself for breaking that trust. But in that moment, scrolling through weeks of messages, I understood something I had never wanted to admit. That betrayal doesn't always begin with touch. Sometimes it begins when someone else listens more closely than you do. The messages weren't graphic, weren't explicitly romantic. They were worse in a quieter way. Conversations about work stress, late nights, shared frustrations, her exhaustion, her sense of being misunderstood. And with every line I read, a single thought settled deeper into my mind, heavy and immovable. When did I become a stranger in my own marriage? I put the phone back exactly where it had been. My heartbeat slow, unnaturally calm, and what surprised me most was the absence of dramatic pain. No vivid images of them together. No explosive anger. Just a dull awareness that something precious had been slipping away for a long time. Right in front of me. Dinner that night passed with an eerie sense of peace. She talked about a new project. About a demanding boss. About a helpful colleague who had pulled her out of a difficult situation. Never naming him, though I knew exactly who she meant. Every word landing softly, persistently, like drops of cold water that never quite let you feel warm again. And I nodded, asked the right questions, even joked a little, enough to make her laugh. And in that laugh I realized something more frightening than the betrayal itself. That I still loved her, deeply enough to pretend I knew nothing at all. That night, after she had fallen asleep, turned away from me, her breathing slow and even, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying 7 years of shared life. The early days when we had so little but somehow felt rich. When a late-night meal could make her smile for hours. When I was the only person she wanted to talk to. And I wondered if waking her up right then, holding her phone out between us and asking one honest question, would bring us back to the beginning, or end everything in the quiet of that room. I did nothing. I closed my eyes and let the thoughts swirl, telling myself I needed time, not to punish her, not to hurt her, but to understand where I stood, and whether I was still willing to play the role of the husband who didn't know. In the days that followed, I started noticing the small things I had once ignored. The way she angled her phone when messages came in. The faint curve of her lips when she read something pleasant. The longer hours at work. The growing distance between us. And each time, I reminded myself to stay calm. To stay convincing. Because I wanted to know how far this would go. And more than that, I wanted to know if, when faced with a choice, she would still remember me. Our story, I realized, didn't begin with a single devastating moment, but with tiny cracks, invisible to everyone else, yet deep enough that if we weren't careful, we would fall through them without ever noticing. When our footing first gave way, I became careful in ways I never had before. Careful with my tone, with my expressions, with the distance I kept and the distance I closed. Because once you know a secret like that, you realize how fragile normalcy really is. How easily it can shatter if you press too hard in the wrong place. And I wasn't ready for the sound of breaking glass yet. I started coming home a little earlier. Not to catch her, not to test her, but to watch, to observe the subtle choreography of our evenings. The way she loosened her hair as soon as she stepped through the door. The way her shoulders dropped when she thought she was finally alone. The way her eyes searched my face for something I wasn't sure I could still give her. She noticed the change. Of course she did. She always noticed small things. And one night while we were eating, she asked if work had been stressful lately. If something was bothering me. Her voice light, concerned, almost tender. And for a brief moment I wondered if this was her chance. Her opening to confess, to pull us back from the edge. But then her phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at it instinctively. Just a fraction of a second too long. And whatever courage might have existed between us dissolved into the space left behind by silence. I shook my head, told her everything was fine. That I just wanted to spend more time at home. And she smiled, relieved, not because she was happy I was there, but because she was glad she didn't have to explain anything. It struck me then how lies don't always look like lies. Sometimes they look like peace, like mutual agreement not to disturb the surface of things. And I wondered how long two people could live like that before the quiet became unbearable. The first real crack came on a Friday night. One of those evenings she used to reserve for us. For takeout and a movie neither of us fully watched. When she told me she had to work late again. Her voice apologetic but practiced. As if she had rehearsed it on the way home. And I nodded, said I understood, because that's what a good husband does. Because I had trained myself to respond that way. But after she left, the apartment felt unnaturally large. Every sound echoing, and for the first time since I had discovered the truth, anger crept in quietly, not explosive, not loud, but sharp enough to hurt. I didn't follow her. I didn't check her location or call to see if she was really at the office. Instead, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the dark screen of the television, thinking about how easy it would be to confront her, to demand honesty. And how much harder it would be to listen to it. She came home after midnight. Moving softly, slipping out of her shoes as if trying not to wake me. And when she peeked into the bedroom and saw me still awake, she froze for a second, guilt flashing across her face before she masked it with a tired smile. And said she was exhausted. That the project was a mess. That she just wanted to sleep. I made room for her beside me, felt the familiar warmth of her body. And for the first time, that closeness felt like distance. Like standing next to someone behind a glass wall that night. She reached for me, hesitantly, as if testing whether we were still us. And I let her, because I wanted to know. Because I needed to feel something real. But even in that intimacy, I could sense her elsewhere. Her mind slightly removed, her movements careful, almost apologetic. And afterward, when she fell asleep quickly, I lay awake again, realizing that sharing a bed doesn't always mean sharing a life the next morning. I found a receipt in her coat pocket while looking for my keys. A small thing, insignificant to anyone else. 2 coffees purchased late at night. Not near her office, but closer to a place I knew well enough. And I stood there holding that thin piece of paper, feeling something inside me settle into certainty. Because doubt, strangely enough, is heavier than truth. I put the receipt back. I didn't ask questions. Instead, I began preparing myself, not for confrontation, but for clarity, because I understood now that whatever happened next, I didn't want to be the man who reacted blindly, who begged or accused or lost himself in someone else's choices. I wanted to know who I was when everything was finally spoken out loud in the days that followed. She grew more distracted, more careful, and at the same time, oddly more attentive to me, cooking my favorite meals, asking about my day with genuine interest, touching my arm when she passed by, as if trying to reassure herself that I was still there, that this life hadn't disappeared yet. And it hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated, because it felt like she was trying to preserve something she was already willing to risk one evening. As we sat together on the couch, the city lights spilling in through the window, she rested her head on my shoulder, quiet for a long time, and then asked, almost casually, if I still felt happy with her. And the question lingered between us, fragile and dangerous, because it was the closest she had come to telling the truth. I swallowed, chose my words carefully, and said that happiness changes. That it isn't always loud or obvious, but that it matters what you do when it starts to fade. She didn't respond right away. She just nodded, eyes fixed on something far away, and in that moment, I knew the calm couldn't last much longer. Because when questions like that surface, it means someone is already preparing for an ending, or hoping desperately for a different one. I let her believe I didn't know. Not because I was weak, but because I was waiting. Waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer be something I had to chase, but something that would come to me on its own, demanding to be faced. The waiting changed me in ways I hadn't expected. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could point out, but quietly, internally, like a slow recalibration of what I was willing to tolerate and what I was no longer afraid of losing. Once you accept that something precious may already be broken, fear loosens its grip, and in that space, clarity begins to grow. I stopped imagining worst-case scenarios because reality, as it unfolded day by day, was already painful enough without embellishment. And strangely, that pain grounded me, anchored me to the present instead of the endless what ifs. She began mentioning him by name. Not often, not carelessly, but enough that it was no longer an accident. She'd say it casually, woven into stories about meetings or deadlines, testing the sound of his name in our shared space, watching my face for any sign of reaction. And each time, I gave her none. I responded the way I always had, neutral, attentive, unthreatened, and I could feel her relax, mistaking my composure for ignorance rather than restraint. It was unsettling how easily she believed I wouldn't notice, how deeply she underestimated the intimacy of living with someone who once knew you better than you knew yourself. One night, she suggested we have dinner with some coworkers. Said it might be nice for me to finally meet the people she spent so much time with. and the invitation felt less like generosity and more like a test. A way to normalize what had already crossed a line. I agreed without hesitation, surprising her, and in that moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not relief, but unease, because she hadn't expected me to step closer to the truth so willingly. The restaurant was loud and brightly lit. The kind of place where conversation floats above clinking glasses and forced laughter. And when he stood up to greet us, extending his hand with a confident smile, I understood immediately why she had been drawn to him. He was attentive without being obvious, charming without effort, the kind of man who made people feel seen simply by looking at them. And as I shook his hand, holding his gaze just a second longer than necessary, I felt no anger, only a detached curiosity, as if I were observing a stranger who had wandered into my life by accident. He talked easily, included me in the conversation, asked about my work, my interests, playing the role of the considerate colleague perfectly, and I wondered if he knew how transparent that made him. Because there is a specific kind of politeness people adopt when they are trying to convince themselves they aren't doing anything wrong. She laughed more than usual that night, leaned slightly toward him when he spoke, her body betraying her before her words ever could. And I sat there, absorbing it all, realizing that seeing the truth so plainly stripped it of some of its power to destroy me. On the way home, she was quieter than usual, watching the city pass by through the car window. And when I asked if she was tired, she nodded quickly, said it had been a long week, and I let the silence stretch, comfortable in a way it hadn't been for months, because I no longer felt compelled to fill it with reassurance. That was the night I understood something essential. I wasn't waiting for her to confess. I was waiting to see who she would become when the balance tipped. When maintaining the lie cost more than telling the truth, the tipping point came sooner than I expected. It arrived not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet admission made accidentally. The kind of truth that slips out when someone is exhausted from carrying it alone. She came home late again, eyes red, movements slow, and instead of heading straight for the bedroom, she sat down at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the cool surface, staring at nothing. I poured her a glass of water, set it in front of her, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said his name. Just his name, softly, like it hurt to say it out loud. She looked up at me then. Really looked at me, and in her expression I saw fear. Not of being discovered, but of being understood, because understanding would mean there was no going back. She told me she was confused, that she hadn't meant for anything to happen, that it had started with conversations, with feeling seen and valued in ways she hadn't realized she'd been missing. And as she spoke, I listened without interruption, without judgment, because this was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment where she finally stopped pretending everything was fine when she finished. She waited for my reaction, bracing herself for anger, for accusations, for the collapse she had been anticipating. And instead, I asked her a simple question, one I had rehearsed countless times in my head. Did she still know who she was when she was with me? The question caught her off guard, and she hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't hurt either of us. And that hesitation told me more than any confession ever could. I told her then that I had known for a while, that I hadn't said anything because I needed to understand what I was standing on before everything shifted. And the relief that washed over her face was immediate and devastating. Because it meant she had been living in fear alone, believing herself clever, when in reality, we had both been silently preparing for the same reckoning we didn't fight that night. There were tears, yes, and exhaustion, and an honesty that felt almost cruel in its precision. But there was also something else, something steadier beneath the pain. The mutual recognition that whatever happened next, It would be decided consciously. Not as the result of denial or cowardice. I told her I wasn't interested in competing with anyone for her attention. That love, to me, had always been about choice. About waking up every day and choosing the same person again, even when it was difficult. And that if she no longer chose me, I would accept it, but I wouldn't stay in a space where I had to pretend I didn't matter. She cried then. Openly, not because she had been caught, but because she finally saw the cost of her silence. The quiet erosion of something that had once been solid and safe. She said she didn't know what she wanted yet. That she felt torn, ashamed, afraid of losing everything. And I nodded. Because confusion is a natural response when you've been avoiding the truth for too long. We agreed on distance, not punishment, not separation, but space to think without lies filling the gaps. And as I watched her pack a small bag to stay with a friend for a few days, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Because regardless of what she chose, I knew I had reclaimed something important, my sense of self. My refusal to beg for honesty that should have been given freely. That night, alone in our apartment, I sat by the window and let the city hum around me. Feeling grief, yes, but also dignity, because loving someone doesn't mean disappearing for them. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for both of you, is to stop pretending the apartment felt different once she was gone. Not emptier in the way I had feared, but quieter, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for months and had finally exhaled. And in that silence I began to hear my own thoughts again. The ones I had been suppressing in the name of keeping things intact. I moved through the rooms slowly, noticing details that had faded into the background of shared life. The indentation on the couch where she always sat with her legs tucked under her. The faint trace of her perfume lingering on the scarf she had left behind. And instead of breaking me, these things grounded me, reminding me that memories don't vanish just because the present changes. The first night alone was the hardest. Not because of loneliness, but because of habit, reaching instinctively for my phone to tell her something trivial. A passing thought, a mundane observation, and then remembering that for now, that channel was closed, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I slept poorly, woke often, but each time I did, I felt a strange steadiness beneath the exhaustion. The kind that comes from finally aligning your actions with your truth. She messaged me the next morning. A simple good morning, followed by a hesitant question about whether I was okay. And I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't falling back into old patterns. The reflex to reassure, to smooth things over at my own expense. I replied honestly, told her I was processing, that I needed time, and the space between her response and mine felt charged. Heavier than any argument we had ever had, because it was filled with things unsaid, things finally being respected. Days passed. Slow and deliberate, I went to work, met friends I had been postponing for too long, reconnected with parts of myself that had quietly receded while I was focused on being a good partner. I wasn't running from the pain, but I wasn't drowning in it either, and that balance surprised me. It made me realize how much energy I had been spending maintaining a version of our marriage that no longer existed. And how freeing it felt to stop performing. She asked to meet after a week. Said she was ready to talk. Really talk. And we chose a small cafe halfway between our routines. Neutral ground where neither of us could retreat into familiarity. When she walked in, she looked tired, stripped of the confidence she had worn so carefully before. And when our eyes met, there was no pretense left, only recognition. Two people acknowledging the weight of what they had built and what they had endangered. She spoke first. Told me she had ended things with him. That she hadn't realized how far she had drifted until she was forced to sit with herself without distractions. And as she spoke, I listened, not clinging to her words as promises, but evaluating them for truth, for accountability. She didn't excuse herself this time. Didn't blame stress or circumstance. She named her choices plainly. Admitted that she had enjoyed the attention, the ease of being admired without having to confront the complexities of a long-term relationship. And that honesty, raw and uncomfortable, mattered more to me than declarations of regret when it was my turn. I told her how invisible I had felt, how slowly and subtly it had happened, how I had questioned my own worth before ever questioning her loyalty. And she cried quietly, not defensively, but with the kind of grief that comes from finally seeing the damage you've caused. I told her I wasn't there to decide our future in one conversation. That trust, once fractured, doesn't heal on a schedule. And that loving her didn't obligate me to return to something that hurt me. She asked me if I still loved her. And the question hung between us, heavy and vulnerable, because love, I had learned, is not a guarantee of continuity. It's a condition that requires care. I told her the truth, that I loved who we had been, that I cared deeply for who she was trying to become, but that love alone wasn't enough to erase what had happened, and that any path forward would have to be built slowly, deliberately, with actions, not words. We left the cafe without resolution, but with something just as important, clarity. There were no ultimatums, no dramatic gestures, just two people facing the reality that repair, if it was possible at all, would require patience and humility from both sides. As I walked home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Because regardless of the outcome, I knew I would be okay. That my sense of self was no longer tethered to her choices that night. Sitting alone again, I understood that a happy ending doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means self-respect. Sometimes it means choosing peace over familiarity. And whatever came next, I was no longer afraid of it. The weeks that followed didn't rush toward a conclusion. And that, I learned, was the hardest part, living in the in-between, where nothing is officially broken and nothing is truly repaired, where every day asks you to sit with uncertainty without trying to tame it. She didn't move back right away. She didn't beg, didn't pressure me with tears or promises. And I respected that restraint more than any dramatic apology, because it told me she was finally listening. Finally understanding that love after betrayal has to be offered, not demanded. We spoke occasionally. Never late at night, never out of habit, always with intention. Sometimes it was practical. Bills, logistics, the mundane threads of a shared life that don't disappear just because emotions are raw. Other times, it was heavier. Reflections she had been writing down. Realizations that surfaced when she was alone. Acknowledgments of the ways she had avoided discomfort by stepping outside our marriage instead of stepping deeper into it. I didn't respond to everything immediately. I allowed myself pauses. Allowed myself to feel without rushing to fix. What surprised me most was how my days began to feel fuller without her constant presence. Not happier in a simplistic sense, but more honest. I cooked for myself, not as an act of survival, but as a small ritual of care. I went running in the evenings, letting the rhythm of my breath replace the constant noise in my head. I slept better. I laughed more easily with friends. And in those moments, guilt crept in, the quiet, insidious kind that whispers that your healing is somehow a betrayal of what you once promised. But I learned to sit with that too, reminding myself that self-preservation is not cruelty. When she finally asked if she could come by the apartment just to talk, I agreed, but I prepared myself carefully, not emotionally armoring up, but grounding myself in the understanding that whatever happened, I would not abandon my boundaries to avoid discomfort. She arrived carrying nothing but herself. No bags, no assumptions, and when she stepped inside, she looked around as if seeing the space for the first time. Noticing the subtle changes, the plants I had moved closer to the window, the absence of small clutter she used to leave behind. We sat across from each other. Not on the couch, but at the table, facing one another openly, and she told me she had started therapy, not as a gesture to win me back, but because she didn't want to repeat this version of herself. Regardless of whether our marriage survived, she spoke about her fear of stagnation, her craving to feel desired without effort, her inability to sit with dissatisfaction without interpreting it as failure. And as I listened, I didn't feel the sharp sting I once expected, but a muted sadness, the kind that comes from realizing how long two people can miss each other while living side by side. I told her something I hadn't said out loud yet. That part of my silence before her confession hadn't just been about waiting for truth, but about mourning the version of us I sensed was already gone. And that letting her believe I didn't know had been my way of saying goodbye slowly, instead of all at once. The admission surprised both of us, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because naming an ending, even an uncertain one, carries weight. She asked me then, quietly, if I could ever trust her again, and I didn't soften my answer. I told her trust wasn't a switch I could flip back on, that it would require time, consistency, transparency that might feel uncomfortable, and even then, there were no guarantees. I also told her something just as important, that I no longer feared a future without her. And that truth, spoken gently, landed harder than any accusation could have. She nodded, tears welling but contained, and said she understood, that loving me meant accepting the possibility that she might lose me. And in that moment, I saw her differently, not as my wife, not as the woman who hurt me, but as a flawed person standing in the consequences of her choices without trying to escape them. That didn't erase the pain, but it shifted it, made it something we could look at directly instead of something lurking in the shadows. When she left that evening, there was no dramatic goodbye, no promise of tomorrow, just a quiet acknowledgement that whatever path we took next would be walked consciously, not out of fear or habit. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a long moment. Not collapsing, not breaking down, but breathing, steady and present, aware that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to disappear. I didn't know yet whether our story would bend back toward each other or finally diverge. But for the first time since the night her phone lit up on the table, I felt aligned with myself. And I understood that any ending that preserves your dignity, that allows you to remain whole, is not a tragedy, but a kind of grace. Time, once it stops being an enemy, reveals its true nature, not as a healer in the sentimental sense, but as a clarifier, stripping away urgency, exposing what remains when desire, guilt, and fear no longer speak the loudest. I stopped counting the days since she had last slept in our bed, since that mattered less than noticing how my body no longer tensed every time my phone buzzed, how my mind no longer rehearsed conversations that might never happen. I was no longer waiting for her decision as if it would define me. Instead, I was watching my own life take shape again, quietly, steadily. Without asking permission, she continued therapy. I knew because she told me, without embellishment, without using it as proof of effort, just as a fact, like someone stating the weather. Sometimes she shared insights, sometimes she didn't, and I noticed that when she spoke now, there was less performance in her voice, fewer carefully chosen phrases meant to protect herself. She was learning, slowly, to tolerate discomfort without escaping it, and that, more than apologies, told me she was changing in ways that didn't depend on whether I stayed or left. We met again. Weeks later, This time, walking through a park neither of us had any emotional claim to. The late afternoon light filtering through trees. The city noise softened into something distant and manageable. We talked about small things at first. Books she was reading, a recipe I had perfected, the way autumn was arriving earlier than usual, and there was an ease to it that surprised us both. Not the ease of pretending everything was fine, but the ease of no longer hiding. She told me she had resigned from her job. Not dramatically, not impulsively, but deliberately. She said she needed distance from the environment where lines had blurred so easily, where she had learned to confuse validation with connection. She didn't ask me what I thought. She didn't frame it as a sacrifice. She simply stated it as a necessary step for herself. And for the first time, I believed her without needing to interrogate her motives. I asked her then what she wanted now, not from me, but from her own life. The question seemed to catch her off guard, because for so long, her wants had been reactive, shaped by dissatisfaction rather than intention. She thought for a while before answering, and when she did, her voice was quieter, steadier. She said she wanted peace without numbness, connection without escape, and the courage to stay present even when things felt ordinary or hard. She said she wanted to be someone she could respect, regardless of who was watching. That answer stayed with me long after we parted ways that day. It echoed in the spaces where anger used to live, and I realized that while betrayal had fractured our marriage, it had also forced both of us into a reckoning we had been postponing for years. The question was no longer whether we could return to what we had been, but whether we could build something that didn't require either of us to disappear. When she asked, eventually, if we could try again, she did it without certainty, without guarantees, acknowledging openly that reconciliation might still fail, that trust might never fully return, and that walking away would remain an option for both of us. That honesty mattered. It shifted the weight of the decision from obligation to choice. I told her I was willing to explore rebuilding, slowly, with conditions that protected my dignity and her accountability. And we agreed that this time, love would not be a refuge from discomfort, but a place where discomfort could be spoken without fear. She didn't move back in right away. We dated each other, awkwardly at first, learning who we were outside the roles we had worn for so long. There were moments of tenderness that felt earned rather than assumed, moments of grief for what we had lost, moments of doubt that we named instead of burying. She was more transparent than I had ever known her to be. Not because she was trying to prove herself, but because secrecy no longer served her, and I changed too. I spoke sooner when something felt off. I stopped translating my needs into silence. I learned that being steady doesn't mean being self-sacrificing, and that boundaries are not threats, but invitations to meet me where I actually stand. One evening, months later, as we cooked together in the same kitchen where everything had once begun to unravel, she reached for my hand, not out of habit, but with intention, and asked me if I was still choosing this, choosing her, choosing us. I looked at her, really looked at her, at the woman who had fallen, who had faced herself, who was no longer asking to be saved, and I answered honestly that I was choosing her today, not because of who she used to be, but because of who she was becoming. The future remained unwritten, uncertain in ways it always had been, but it no longer frightened me, because whatever ending awaited us, it would not be built on denial. It would be built on presence, on choice, on the quiet strength of two people who had learned, the hard way, that love is not proven by how much you endure in silence, but by how fully you are willing to stand in the truth. Choosing each other again did not feel like a victory lap. There was no swell of triumph, no cinematic reassurance that we had survived something extraordinary and emerged purified on the other side. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of unfamiliar ground with a map you had drawn yourself. Aware of every past misstep, every place where the earth had once given way, we moved forward cautiously, not because we were afraid, but because we had learned the cost of carelessness. She began staying over occasionally, never assuming, always asking, and the first time she slept beside me again, it was nothing like the intimacy we once took for granted. There was a careful distance between our bodies, a mutual awareness that closeness now required consent in ways it never had before. I lay awake listening to her breathing, not searching for betrayal, not replaying old wounds, but noticing how present she felt, how she no longer retreated into sleep to escape discomfort, how she stayed awake with me when thoughts grew heavy, as if finally understanding that love sometimes means enduring the quiet together. There were setbacks. Moments when a late reply to a message tightened something in my chest. Moments when a name mentioned in passing made her stiffen, reminded us both of how fragile trust still was. But this time, we didn't let those moments rot in silence. We spoke about them, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes clumsily, but always honestly, and each conversation felt like laying another plank across a space that once seemed impossible to cross one evening. Weeks later, she told me something she had been afraid to admit. That part of her had believed I would never leave, that my steadiness had felt permanent, unshakable, and that instead of cherishing it, she had taken it as permission to drift. The admission hurt, but it also clarified something important. Not just about her, but about me, about how my quiet endurance had blurred into invisibility, how being reliable without being expressive had allowed distance to grow unnoticed. I told her I accepted responsibility for my silence, not for her choices, but for my absence within the relationship, and that distinction mattered, because it allowed accountability without self-erasure. As months passed, the rhythm of our lives began to shift. She found new work, smaller, less glamorous, but aligned with the values she was slowly redefining. And I watched her learn to tolerate the ordinariness she once ran from. Watched her sit with boredom, frustration, even disappointment, without seeking escape. I admired her for that, quietly, cautiously, because admiration after betrayal is not blind. It is earned, moment by moment. And yet, something else began to surface within me. Something unexpected. As I grew stronger, more grounded, more at ease with the possibility of being alone, I realized that reconciliation was no longer the only version of a happy ending I could imagine. This awareness didn't make me pull away, but it made me honest with myself in ways I had never allowed before. I wasn't staying because I was afraid to start over. I was staying because, for now, I wanted to, and that distinction changed everything. One night, during a long walk through quiet streets, she asked me if I still resented her, and I thought carefully before answering. Because resentment is a subtle thing. It disguises itself as vigilance, as righteousness, as memory. I told her that resentment fades when it is replaced with choice. That as long as I felt free to leave, resentment had no place to settle. She stopped walking then, looked at me with a mixture of sadness and relief, because hearing that meant she could no longer rely on my endurance as a guarantee. And strangely, that made our connection feel more equal than it had ever been. We talked that night about the future in practical terms. Not dreams or promises, but logistics, timelines, possibilities. And when the conversation turned to whether we would ever return to being husband and wife in the way we once were, I surprised both of us by saying I didn't want to go back. I wanted something different, something slower, something built with awareness instead of assumption. She nodded, eyes glossy but steady, and said she wanted the same. Even if it meant redefining everything she thought marriage was supposed to be. The realization settled gently between us. That healing doesn't always restore what was lost. Sometimes it transforms it into something new. Something quieter, less performative, but more real. We were no longer chasing the illusion of what we used to be. We were deciding, day by day, whether what we were becoming still made sense together, and in that ongoing choice, that refusal to cling or rush, I found something I hadn't expected at the beginning of all this. Not closure, not certainty, but peace, the kind that comes from knowing that whatever happens next, I will not abandon myself to keep someone else from leaving. Peace has a way of sharpening your vision, not blurring it, and once I settled into that quiet steadiness, I began to see the remaining fractures clearly, not as wounds demanding immediate repair, but as truths asking to be acknowledged. Loving her again, in this new, conscious way, required energy, presence, and a willingness to revisit pain without weaponizing it. And some days I had that strength. Some days I didn't. The difference now was that I no longer punished myself for either state. She sensed the shift before I named it. She always had that intuition. The ability to feel emotional weather changes before clouds fully formed. One evening, as we sat across from each other with untouched cups of tea cooling between us, she asked if something had changed again. Not with accusation, not with fear, but with a calm attentiveness that would have been impossible months earlier. I took a long breath before answering, because the truth deserved care, and told her that while I respected who she was becoming, while I valued the honesty we had rebuilt, I was no longer sure that rebuilding our marriage was where my deepest sense of peace lived. The words landed softly but decisively. She didn't cry right away. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened, absorbing the reality that growth, no matter how sincere, does not guarantee reunion. I explained that the betrayal had forced me to discover parts of myself I had neglected for years. My autonomy, my voice, my capacity to stand alone without resentment, and that in finding those things, I had also discovered a version of happiness that didn't depend on salvaging what had been broken. Loving her no longer meant choosing her, and that distinction mattered more than I ever expected it to. She nodded slowly, eyes shimmering but steady, and said she understood, not fully, not without pain, but enough to respect it. She admitted that part of her had hoped becoming better would be enough to bring us back together. And saying that out loud, without self-pity, without bargaining, was perhaps the most honest moment between us yet. I told her that her growth was real, that it mattered, that it would shape the rest of her life in meaningful ways. Even if that life no longer unfolded beside mine. We talked late into the night. Not circling the same arguments, but sharing gratitude, grief, and responsibility with a clarity that felt almost sacred. We acknowledged what we had given each other, what we had failed to protect, and what we were no longer willing to compromise. There was no villain in that room, no winner or loser, only two people recognizing that love can be genuine and still reach its natural end. When we finally said goodbye, it was not dramatic. She packed the last few things she still kept in the apartment, folded carefully, deliberately, as if honoring the space rather than fleeing it. At the door, she paused, looked at me with a softness free of regretful fantasy, and thanked me, not for staying, not for forgiving, but for refusing to lie to myself. Because that honesty, she said, had changed her more than any punishment ever could. After she left, I stood alone in the doorway for a long time, not aching, not relieved, but profoundly calm. I had not been abandoned, and I had not abandoned her. We had simply stopped trying to force a future that no longer fit who we had become. Months passed. Life continued in quiet, meaningful ways. I moved apartments, not to escape memories, but to mark a new chapter. I filled my days with work that challenged me, friendships that nourished me, mornings that felt unhurried and whole. Occasionally, I heard about her through mutual acquaintances. That she was doing well. That she seemed grounded, and I felt genuine warmth at the thought, untainted by longing one evening. Much later, as I sat by a window in a new place, watching city lights blink on one by one, I thought back to the man who had stood frozen in his kitchen, staring at a phone lighting up with a message he wasn't meant to see. I felt compassion for him, for his patience, his restraint, his quiet endurance. I understood now that letting her believe I didn't know had never been about avoidance. It had been about giving myself time to grow into someone who could face the truth without losing himself, and that, I realized, was the true happy ending. Not reunion for its own sake, not triumph over betrayal, but the preservation of dignity, the reclaiming of self, and the knowledge that love, even when it ends, does not have to destroy you. I turned off the light, content in the darkness, certain of one thing above all else: I had chosen myself. And in doing so, I had finally learned what it meant to love well, even when the story doesn't end the way you once imagined. The strangest thing about endings is that life doesn't pause to acknowledge them. There is no ceremonial silence. No moment where the world steps aside and says this mattered. The days simply continue, unfolding with the same quiet insistence as always. And you learn, gradually, that closure is not something you receive, but something you practice. A year passed without my noticing the exact moment it began. I measured time differently now, not in anniversaries or milestones, but in how naturally my mornings started. In how rarely my thoughts circled back to what had been lost. I learned which cafes felt like mine, which streets I preferred walking when I needed to think, which evenings were meant for solitude rather than distraction. My life no longer felt like a recovery. It felt like ownership. I dated, eventually, not to replace her, not to prove anything, but because curiosity had returned, quiet and unforced. There was a woman I met through a friend, someone who listened without trying to fix, who asked questions and waited for real answers. With her, I noticed how different love feels when you are not trying to earn it by disappearing. I noticed how easily I spoke my needs, how naturally I walked away from situations that felt misaligned, without resentment, without drama. The past had taught me discernment, not bitterness. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought of my former wife. Not with longing, but with a distant affection. The kind reserved for people who once shared your interior world. We exchanged a message once. On a birthday, brief and sincere, she thanked me again, in her own words, for the honesty that had forced her to grow. I wished her well, and meant it fully. When the conversation ended, there was no ache left behind, only gratitude for having loved and learned without losing myself. What I came to understand, slowly and without fanfare, was that betrayal had not been the defining event of my life. My response to it had been the choice to wait rather than explode, to observe rather than accuse, to leave not in anger but in clarity. Those decisions had shaped the person I became far more than the pain ever could. I no longer needed the story to justify itself. I no longer needed it to sound dramatic or tragic or heroic. It was simply true. Two people met, loved imperfectly, failed, and grew in different directions. And one of them, at least, learned to remain whole on an ordinary evening, not unlike the one where it all began. I stood in my kitchen again. Light soft against the walls. City sounds humming faintly through an open window. My phone lit up on the counter with a message. A simple question from someone new. Did you get home yet? I smiled. Not because of the message itself, but because this time, there was no fear attached to it. No loss of self hiding beneath the familiarity. I replied honestly. Present in my life. Present in my body. Present in my choices. That was how I knew the story had ended well. Not because love returned, but because I did. That's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment with your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.